Beyond True Stories, page 135, Chosen. In 1940, a year before the United States entered World War II, Irvin Scott volunteered for service in the U.S. Marines. He was 19 years old, 6 feet tall, and weighed 170 pounds. In 1945, when the war ended, he weighed 98 pounds after spending almost the entire war as a prisoner of the Japanese. His survival was due partly to his own strength, both physical and mental, and partly to the kindness of two men, a Japanese guard and an American comrade. After the war began, Scott was sent to the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. He was with a special radar unit that tried to detect incoming Japanese planes. 4 months later, the Philippine Islands were taken by the Japanese military, and Scott, along with thousands of other American servicemen, surrendered. Eventually, Scott was sent to Tayabas, a province on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. He and the other 300 American prisoners of war at Tayabas were ordered to finish building a road that the U.S. military had begun. Tayabas is located in the jungle, where heat, rain, and mosquitoes combine to make the conditions ideal for the spread of malaria. Over 100 of the 300 Americans died in the first 3 months at Tayabas. The prisoners who came down with malaria would lie outside on rocks in the pouring rain, seeking relief from their fevers. Scott, too, came down with malaria, but remained strong enough to work. One day, he sat down to rest at the side of the road he was helping to build. In an attempt to keep his spirits up, he began to hum the aria Un bel dì from the opera Madame Butterfly, his mother's favorite. As he sat at the roadside and hummed, Scott heard footsteps behind him and then a voice. The voice of a Japanese guard who said, "I know that song." The guard explained in English that when he was a teenager in Japan, he had worked for an American couple who had played Un bel dì on a phonograph. Madame Butterfly had been their favorite opera, too. Scott never turned around as the guard spoke. Guards and prisoners were not allowed to communicate, and Scott knew that if he and the guard were seen talking, both men's lives would be in danger. The guard finished speaking, and Scott heard the soft thud of something being dropped. When Scott turned around, the guard was gone. On the ground, there was a banana leaf wrapped around rice and a banana. The Japanese guard was on duty every other day. Every time he was on duty, he managed to pass Scott, and as he did, he dropped some food wrapped in a banana leaf. Apparently, the guard was sharing his lunch with his American prisoner. The guard never spoke to Scott, and Scott never spoke to him. Scott never even learned the guard's name. Several weeks later, Scott, whose malaria had worsened, passed out on the road he was working on. A fellow prisoner of war, Bill White, whom Scott did not know, carried him back to the camp, an act of heroism, as Bill White, like Scott, was sick and weak. Every few hours, White would carry Scott down to a creek to bathe him in cool water to try to bring his fever down. He fed him a mixture of rice and water the prisoners made, as well as the food the Japanese guard continued to drop at Scott's side. White also gave Scott quinine tablets for the malaria. At first, Scott was too delirious with fever to realize what he was being fed, but when he was stronger, he asked White where he had gotten the quinine tablets. White told Scott to wait until the afternoon and to keep an eye on the guard. Irvin Scott, who is now over 80 years old, remembers clearly what he saw that afternoon. This Japanese guard came walking across the rocks. All the prisoners were lying out on the rocks, dying or barely able to move because of the malaria. As the guard passed by, he dropped something wrapped in a banana leaf. He kept walking and said nothing. Bill unwrapped the leaf, and in it was some rice and a little piece of paper. Inside the paper were 2 tablets of quinine. With the help of Bill White and the food and quinine from the Japanese guard, Scott eventually regained some strength. He and Bill White were at Tayabas for the entire summer of 1942. Then they were sent to a former American Army base near Manila that had been captured by the Japanese. They were there for about 2 years, and during that time, Scott and White became close friends. In 1944, Irvin Scott and Bill White were sent to Japan aboard separate ships. White's ship was sunk by torpedoes, but Scott's ship continued on to Japan. He worked in a coal mine there until the war ended in 1945 and then returned to the United States aboard a hospital ship. From time to time, Scott thinks about Tayabas. He thinks about Bill White, who fed him the quinine tablets that the guard dropped. White had malaria too, and no one would have known if he had swallowed the medicine instead of giving it to Scott. Scott also thinks about the Japanese guard. The 2 quinine tablets were half of the guard's ration of 4 tablets, so the guard was risking dying of malaria himself. That, however, was the smaller risk. If the guard's superiors had seen him dropping the food and medicine, he would have been shot. Scott can only speculate why, of all the prisoners at Tayabas, the guard chose to save him. Who knows why he did it, Scott says. I don't know to this day. He had to know something was wrong with what was happening. He had compassion, and I was the one he decided to help. I can only think it was because he heard me humming the melody Un Bel Dì. The license plate on Scott's car says POW, prisoner of war. The license plate is a reminder of all the hardships Scott endured. Yet Scott does not hate the Japanese. On the contrary, he says the Japanese are good human beings. What is the explanation for Scott's lack of hatred? Does he recognize that in war there is suffering on both sides, and that Japanese suffered at the hands of the Americans just as he suffered at the hands of the Japanese? Perhaps he does. But there is also a simpler explanation. Scott finds it impossible to hate the Japanese because of the kindness and courage of one Japanese guard. Scott's car, the one with the POW license plate, is a Honda Accord.